Alessandro Cruz was stepping out of his matte black SUV when a small, trembling hand blocked his path. It wasn't a rival's blade or a police badge. It was a piece of bread, crusty, dry, and torn unevenly in half. He looked down. A boy no older than 4 stood there in a stained gray t-shirt, his eyes wide with a terrifying kind of courage. The city's most dangerous man froze. His enforcers moved in, ready to clear the nuisance, but Alessandro raised a tattooed hand, stopping them cold. Nobody offered Alessandro Cruz a smack. People offered him tributes, percentages, or pleas for their lives. He knelt, his gold chain catching the dim streetlight, and looked the boy in the eye. "I'm busy, kid," Alessandro said, his voice a low growl. "Why are you giving me your lunch?" The boy's voice didn't just tremble, it nearly broke. "It's not a gift," Sammy whispered. "It's a payment. I want to hire you to bring my mama back because the men who took her said the police work for them." That made the air in the neighborhood turn cold. Alessandro took the bread. It was stale, a kind of food you eat when there's nothing else left in the cupboard. He realized in that moment that while he'd been busy running an empire, vultures had moved into his streets, men who stole mothers from hungry children. "They said if I told anyone, she'd never come home," Sammy said, a single tear tracking through the dirt on his cheek. Alessandro looked at the boy's bruised shins and the way he kept glancing at a white van parked 3 blocks away. Alessandro didn't need the bread, and he certainly didn't need the trouble, but he looked at the half-loaf in his hand and realized that if a toddler was brave enough to sacrifice his only meal to save his family, a king should be brave enough to burn down anyone who stood in his way. Stay with me until the end, and don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Because what Alessandro Cruz did with that piece of bread and the men who took Sammy's mother became a legend that changed the city's heart forever. The neighborhood of El Mirador didn't breathe until Alessandro Cruz's SUV turned the corner. It was a matte black beast that prowled the cracked asphalt, its engine a low, predatory hum that sent street vendors scurrying to pull their carts back and caused the local lookouts to straighten their backs. When the door opened, the air itself seemed to grow heavy. Alessandro stepped out, and the sidewalk became his stage. He was the king of the concrete, a man built from iron and ambition, possessing a muscular, fit frame that filled the silhouette of his tailored black suit with intimidating ease. He didn't look like the mobsters of the old world who hid in the shadows of social clubs. Alessandro was a modern predator. His dark hair was clipped into a sharp, surgical fade, and his short beard was groomed to a perfection that mirrored his lethal discipline. As he adjusted his jacket, the fabric pulled back to reveal the story of his life etched into his skin. Bold, black ink climbed his throat and peeked out from the open collar of his shirt, framing a heavy gold chain that glinted like a trophy against his chest. To the people of El Mirador, those tattoos were a warning map of the lines you never crossed. He was the man who kept the peace by being the most dangerous thing in the valley. Yet, as the heavy door of the Cadillac thudded shut, the feared Don didn't keep walking toward the high-stakes meeting awaiting him inside the glass-fronted bistro. Instead, he stopped. His polished shoes, worth more than most of the cars on the block, came to a halt on the gritty pavement. He felt a tug, not the aggressive jerk of a thief, but a soft, hesitant pull on his sleeve. Behind him, his enforcers, Tony and Marco, tensed. Their hands moved instinctively toward the waistbands of their slacks, their eyes scanning the rooftops for a trap. In their world, any touch was a threat. But Alessandro felt something different. He turned, his sharp, confident gaze softening as it traveled downward. There, standing amidst the shadows of giants, was Sammy. The boy was tiny, a preschooler who looked like he had been swallowed by his own oversized gray t-shirt. His brown hair was a bird's nest of tangles, and his denim jeans were worn white at the knees from playing in the dirt. He looked like a stray spark in a dark room, small, flickering, and impossibly brave. The crowd gathered at a distance, hushed and horrified. They expected Alessandro to sneer, to brush the dirt of the streets off his expensive wool sleeve, or worse, to let his men handle the interference. But Alessandro did something that would be whispered about for months. He didn't tower over the boy. He didn't use his height to intimidate. Slowly, with the fluid grace of a jungle cat, the most feared man in the city lowered himself. He knelt on one knee, regardless of the grime on the sidewalk, bringing his tattooed neck and serious face level with the toddler's eyes. Up close, the boy looked even more fragile, yet his expression wasn't one of terror. It was a calm, profound sadness that seemed too heavy for such small shoulders. Sammy didn't see the gold chain or the ink that marked a killer. He saw the only man strong enough to move mountains. While the rest of the city saw a monster, the boy saw a monument. Alessandro reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering for a second before gently resting near the boy's arm. He was holding a roll of hundreds he'd intended for a payoff, but he let the money slip into his palm, forgotten. "You've got 10 seconds before my coffee gets cold, kid," Alessandro said. His voice was a gravelly rumble, but the jagged edges had been sanded down. He wasn't talking to an informant or a rival. He was talking to a soul that hadn't been corrupted yet. "Why aren't you home?" Sammy didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached into the small pocket of his jeans and pulled out a piece of bread. It was a simple hunk of a baguette, torn clumsily in half, leaving crumbs on his small fingers. He held it out, like a sacred offering, his hands trembling just enough to show the effort it took to stay standing. "Please," Sammy whispered, his voice small but carrying through the silent street. "Please help my mom. I don't have gold, but I have this. It's the best piece." Alessandro stared at the bread. In his world, loyalty was bought with blood, and empires were traded for suitcases of untraceable bills. He had seen every form of greed and every shade of betrayal, but he had never seen this. A child, clearly hollow-cheeked for hunger, was offering up his own survival for the sake of another. The king of the concrete felt a crack in the armor he had spent 15 years forging. The boy wasn't just asking for a favor, he was offering a contract of the heart, one that Alessandro Cruz, for all his power, wasn't sure he was worthy to sign. The stale scent of the bread hung in the air between them, a humble bridge spanning the gap between a king and a beggar. Alessandro looked at the jagged edges of the crust, then back at Sammy's face. The boy's eyes were pools of ancient grief, the kind that shouldn't exist in a child who had barely seen 4 summers. Alessandro reached out, his large calloused fingers brushing against Sammy's small ones as he took the bread. He didn't toss it aside or hand it to an enforcer. He held it with a strange, heavy reverence, as if it weighed more than the gold chain around his neck. "Talk to me, Sammy," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency that shut out the rest of the street. "Where is your mother? And who are these men you're so afraid of?" Sammy took a shaky breath, his small chest hitching under the gray t-shirt. He pointed a trembling finger toward the end of the block, where the shadows of the high-rises began to swallow the light. He explained, in the fragmented, heartbreaking logic of a child, that he had no gold coins or paper pictures to give. He told Alessandro that he had waited by the door for 2 nights, holding on to this piece of bread, because it was the lunch his mother had promised they would share before the world went quiet. "They came when the sun was going down," Sammy whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "The men in the white van. They didn't knock. They just took Mama. She told me to hide under the bed and count to 1,000, but I only know how to count to 10, so I just stayed there forever." Alessandro's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing beneath his beard. He knew the vultures Sammy was describing. They weren't soldiers, they were scavengers. He had heard whispers of a rogue crew, men who didn't belong to any family, who ignored the old codes of the street to squeeze blood from stones. Sammy continued, his words tumbling out faster now, fueled by the desperate hope that someone was finally listening. He spoke of the paper with the red ink that the men had waved in his mother's face, a debt left behind by a father Sammy barely remembered, a man who had gambled away his family's safety before disappearing into a bottle or a grave. "They said Papa owed them all the money in the world," Sammy said, a single tear finally escaping and carving a path through the dust on his cheek. "They said Mama had to go with them to pay it back. I tried to give them my bread then, but the man with the snake on his neck just laughed. He pushed me down and told me to tell anyone who asked that the vultures own this street now." At the mention of the snake tattoo, the air around Alessandro seemed to turn to ice. He knew that mark. It belonged to a low-level enforcer named Silas, a man who had once tried to beg for a seat at Alessandro's table and had been rejected for his lack of stomach. To think that such a man was now snatching mothers from their homes in Alessandro's own backyard was a slap to the face that burned hotter than any rival's bullet. Alessandro looked at the bread in his hand, then at the bruised knees of the boy standing before him. The vultures hadn't just taken a woman, they had declared that Alessandro's protection was a lie. They were betting that the king of the concrete was too busy with his millions to notice a single mother and a hungry boy. They were betting that he had forgotten the smell of the streets. "Sammy," Alessandro said, his voice regaining that sharp, confident edge that made men tremble, though his eyes remained fixed on the boy. "You said you wanted to hire me. You said this bread was your payment." Sammy nodded solemnly, his small hands now empty and folded in front of him. "It's the best piece, Mr. Alessandro. I didn't even take a bite." Alessandro stood up, his tall, muscular frame unfolding like a dark omen. He tucked the piece of bread into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, placing it right against his heart. He looked at Tony and Marco, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light that signaled the end of the piece. The meeting at the bistro was forgotten. The paper pictures in his hand were irrelevant. "Tony," Alessandro barked, not breaking eye level with the boy, "get the car. We're not going to the meeting. We're going hunting." He turned back to Sammy, reaching out to gently ruffle the boy's messy brown hair. "You did good, kid. You bought the best protection this city has to offer. Now go to Mrs. Gable's bakery across the street. Tell Alessandro said to give you whatever you want to eat. I'm gonna go find your mama." As the black SUV roared to life, Sammy stood on the sidewalk watching the red taillights disappear into the gloom. For the first time in 3 days, the boy didn't feel small. He had handed over his last meal, and in return, he had set a monster loose on the men who had stolen his world. The black SUV sat idling, its exhaust a rhythmic thrum against the pavement, but Alessandro didn't move. He remained on the threshold of the open door, his polished shoe hovering over the curb. In his inner pocket, the weight of the torn bread felt heavier than the concealed pistol on his hip. He looked back at Sammy, who was still standing exactly where he had been left, a tiny figure framed by the crumbling brickwork of El Mirador. The boy's hands were tucked into his pockets now, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself small enough for the world to overlook. Just as Alessandro prepared to pull the door shut, a sound cut through the low rumble of the engine. It was a sharp, liquid protest, the unmistakable hollow growl of a stomach that hadn't seen a meal in days. It was so loud in the sudden stillness of the street that even Tony, sitting in the driver's seat, glanced toward the window. Alessandro froze. He looked at Sammy's midsection, where the gray T-shirt clung to a frame that was far too thin. The boy instinctively pressed a small hand against his belly, his face flushing with a shy, embarrassed heat. He looked down at his scuffed sneakers, trying to hide the sound, but his body was betraying the truth he was too proud to speak. In that moment, the king of the concrete felt a coldness spread through his veins that had nothing to do with the evening air. Alessandro had spent his life calculating risks, measuring profits, and weighing the cost of loyalty. He dealt in the currency of power, where hunger was usually just a metaphor for ambition. But this was different. This was the raw, aching reality of a child who had been starving for 48 hours and had still chosen to give away his only hope of a meal. Sammy hadn't just offered a payment, he had offered his very life. He had stood before the most dangerous man in the city, and while his own body was screaming for sustenance, he had handed over his survival to buy a miracle for his mother. Alessandro reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of bread. He looked at the dry, dusty crust. He imagined Sammy sitting alone in that dark apartment for 2 nights, listening to his own hunger, staring at this bread, and refusing to take a single bite because it was the only thing he had left to trade. It was a level of honor Alessandro hadn't encountered in a decade of dealing with grown men. Most of the associates he broke bread with would sell their own mothers for a fraction of what Sammy was sacrificing. "Tony?" Alessandro said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that made the driver go rigid. "Boss?" Tony asked, surprised. "The vultures, they're moving fast. If we don't get to the shipyard—" "I said, kill the engine," Alessandro barked, his eyes never leaving Sammy. The silence that followed was absolute. Alessandro stepped back onto the sidewalk and walked toward the boy. He didn't kneel this time. He stood before him like a protective shadow. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a gold-foiled chocolate bar he kept for his own blood sugar during long meetings. He stripped the foil with a sharp, decisive snap and handed it to Sammy. "Eat," Alessandro commanded. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. Sammy looked at the chocolate, then up at Alessandro, his eyes wide. "But the bread, do I get it back?" "No," Alessandro said, his chest tightening. "The bread is mine. We had a deal. But a man can't work for a boss who's too weak to stand. You eat that, and you go to Mrs. Gable's. You tell her to give you the soup with the heavy cream and the thickest ham. You tell Alessandro was watching the tab." He watched as Sammy took a tentative bite, the boy's eyes fluttering closed as the sugar hit his system. The way Sammy ate, with a desperate, controlled urgency, confirmed Alessandro's worst fears. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a slow-motion execution of a family's dignity. As Sammy began to chew, Alessandro turned his back, unable to look at the boy's desperation any longer. He felt a surge of fury so potent that it made his vision blur. The vultures weren't just criminals, they were parasites. They had watched this child starve while they waited for a debt that could never be paid. They had insulted the very ground Alessandro walked on by bringing this kind of filth into his zip code. He climbed back into the SUV, slamming the door with a force that rattled the frame. He didn't look at the bread in his hand. He tucked it back into his pocket like a loaded weapon. "Drive," Alessandro said, staring straight ahead at the darkening horizon. "And Tony, don't stop for the lights. If any of Silas's people are on the street, don't waste time talking. I want them to see us coming. I want them to know that the bill for that bread just came due, and the interest is going to cost them everything." The SUV roared to life, tires screaming against the asphalt as it tore away from the curb. Behind them, Sammy stood with the chocolate in his hand, watching the king go to war for a half loaf of bread. The interior of the SUV was a tomb of silent fury as it sped toward the industrial district. Alessandro sat in the back, his fingers tracing the rough texture of the bread in his pocket. To any other man, it was a piece of trash. To him, it was a heavy, condemning weight. He wasn't just angry at the vultures anymore. He was haunted by the realization that his own fortress had holes in it. A kidnapping of this magnitude, involving a white van and midday thuggery, couldn't happen in El Mirador without his street-level soldiers knowing. And if they knew, they had allowed it. "Tony," Alessandro said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Who was on the corner of 5th and Main 2 nights ago? Who had the night shift on the east perimeter?" Tony cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "That would be Rico and Javier, boss. They're usually solid. They've been with the crew since the docks." "Bring them to the basement of the packing plant," Alessandro commanded. Now. 20 minutes later, the air in the plant's basement was thick with the smell of salt and cold blood. Rico and Javier stood under the harsh glare of a single overhead bulb, their shadows stretching long and distorted against the concrete floor. They looked like the loyal soldiers they were supposed to be, black leather jackets, disciplined stances, and eyes that usually didn't blink. But when Alessandro walked into the light, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't come in shouting. He walked slowly, removing his suit jacket and draping it over a meat hook, revealing the ink that crawled up his muscular arms like dark vines. He reached into the jacket pocket, pulled out Sammy's piece of bread, and placed it on a wooden crate between the two men. It looked absurd in that violent setting, a small, dusty bit of food sitting in the center of a criminal empire's nerve center. "Do you know what this is?" Alessandro asked, his voice echoing off the damp walls. The men looked at each other, confusion flickering in their eyes. "It's bread, boss," Rico ventured, his voice cracking. "It's a contract," Alessandro hissed, stepping into Rico's personal space. "It's a payment from a 4-year-old boy whose mother was taken while you were supposedly guarding the block. A boy who hasn't eaten in 2 days because he saved his lunch to buy the protection you were already paid to provide." He watched their faces. Javier's eyes dropped to the floor, but Rico's pupils dilated, a telltale sign of guilt Alessandro had seen 1,000 times. He didn't wait for a confession. He reached out and grabbed Rico by the throat, his grip like a vice, lifting the man until his toes barely touched the concrete. "How much?" Alessandro asked, his face inches from Rico's. "How much was a mother's life worth to you? What did Silas pay you to look the other way while that white van rolled through my territory?" "Boss, please," Rico wheezed, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. Alessandro slammed him against a steel pillar, the sound ringing through the basement like a gunshot. "The vultures are a virus, Rico, but a virus only survives if the body is weak. You made my family weak. You took money from a man with a snake on his neck and let him starve a child in my streets." Javier crumbled first, falling to his knees as Alessandro's cold fury filled the room. "It was $5,000, boss, just $5,000. Silas said it was just a domestic dispute, a runaway debt. He said you wouldn't care about a nobody like Elena Rivera." Alessandro let go of Rico, who slumped to the floor, gasping for air. The Mafia boss looked down on his hands, disgusted. The betrayal stung more than the crime itself. These men had eaten at his table, had been protected by his name, and they had sold that honor for a pittance. They had looked at Sammy and seen a nobody, while Alessandro looked at Sammy and saw the only thing in this city worth saving. $5,000, Alessandro whispered, a dark, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "You sold your lives for $5,000. Sammy's bread is worth more than both of you combined." He turned his back on them, nodding toward Tony, who stood in the shadows with a heavy, silenced pistol. "Take their phones, find out where Silas is keeping the woman, then clear the house. I don't want them in my city by sunrise. If they're ever seen in El Mirador again, don't call me, just finish it." As Tony led the 2 disgraced soldiers toward the back exit, Alessandro remained alone in the light. He picked up the piece of bread and held it again. The internal justice was done, but the rage in his chest hadn't subsided. It had only sharpened into a fine, lethal point. He now had a location, an old apartment complex on the edge of the shipyard, a place the vultures thought was safe because they believed the king was too high up to look down. He put his jacket back on, feeling the cold weight of the bread against his ribs once more. He had cleaned his house. Now he was going to burn down the nest where the vultures slept. "Tony," Alessandro called out as his lieutenant returned, "load the heavy gear. No more warnings, no more business. We're going to show Silas what happens when he tries to feed my people." The SUV tore out of the packing plant, leaving the shadows of betrayal behind. Alessandro stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. He thought of Sammy eating his chocolate bar, waiting for a promise to be kept. The king was no longer just protecting territory. He was redeeming his own soul, one piece of bread at a time. The shipyard district felt like a place where the city had simply given up. Here, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant salt water and industrial rot, a stark contrast to the manicured streets where Alessandro usually conducted his high-level affairs. The SUV rolled through the fog like a shark in dark water, coming to a halt 2 blocks away from the St. Jude Apartments, a skeletal remains of a building that loomed over the docks. It was a derelict hive of broken windows and graffiti-scarred concrete, the perfect place for a crew like the Vultures to hide. They chose it because they thought the darkness would protect them, but they failed to realize that Alessandro Cruz was the one who controlled the shadows. Alessandro stepped out of the vehicle, the cold wind whipping the tails of his black suit. Around him, the night came alive with the silent, rhythmic movement of his elite team. These weren't the street-level soldiers like Rico or Javier. These were his shadows, men who had served in special forces and lived in the quiet spaces between life and death. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency, fanning out across the perimeter like a closing noose. There were no shouted orders, no flashy displays of power, only the metallic click of safeties being disengaged and the soft thud of tactical boots on gravel. Standing on the edge of the shipyard, Alessandro looked up at the 3rd floor. A single flickering light was visible through a window covered in plastic sheeting. That was the nest. He reached into his inner pocket, his fingers grazing the rough crust of Sammy's bread one last time before his hand moved to the grip of his customized .45. The weight of the bread felt like a moral compass, grounding him as he prepared to step back into the violence that had built his empire. "Positions," Alessandro whispered into his comms. "North side secured," Tony's voice crackled back. "Thermal imaging shows 4 heat signatures in the main room, 1 separate in the back. Looks like the target. She's restrained." "South stairs locked down," Marco reported. "No way in or out. The Vultures are trapped, boss." Alessandro felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. Silas and his crew were sitting in that room, likely drinking cheap whiskey and laughing about how they had outsmarted the king. They thought they were playing a game of numbers and debts, but they were about to learn that Alessandro Cruz was playing a game of souls. By kidnapping Elena and starving Sammy, they hadn't just broken a law, they had insulted the very concept of honor. "Breach on my signal," Alessandro commanded. He walked toward the main entrance, his posture straight and his expression as cold as the sea. He didn't wear a mask or a helmet. He wanted Silas to see his face. He wanted the man with the snake on his neck to know exactly whose world he had tried to burn down. As he approached the rusted steel door of the complex, the team closed the gap. A sniper on the adjacent rooftop signaled a green light. The efficiency was absolute, a masterclass in tactical suppression. In less than 3 minutes, Alessandro's team had turned a derelict apartment complex into a cage. The Vultures were no longer predators, they were prey, and the king of the concrete had come to collect the bill. Alessandro stood before the door, the gold chain around his neck catching a stray beam of moonlight. He took a deep breath, the smell of the shipyard filling his lungs. The time for internal justice was over. Now it was time for the world to see what happened when you tried to pay a debt with a child's lunch. "Execute," he whispered. The night exploded into a symphony of controlled chaos. Flashbangs lit up the 3rd-floor windows like dying stars, and the sound of the door being kicked from its hinges echoed across the empty docks. Alessandro stepped into the stairwell, moving upward with the steady, unstoppable momentum of a landslide. He wasn't just a mafia boss entering a building. He was the personification of a neighborhood's rage, coming to take back what was stolen. The heavy steel door didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of a hydraulic ram, the scream of twisting metal lost beneath the blinding white pulse of a flashbang. Alessandro stepped through the haze of smoke and plaster dust before the echoes had even faded. He moved with a terrifying, calm deliberation, his .45 held low and steady, a shadow emerging from the fire. Inside, the room was a portrait of squalor, half-empty bottles, overflowing ashtrays, and the panicked, blinded scrambling of men who had thought they were untouchable. Silas was the first to regain his sight, his hand clawing desperately for a pistol on the scarred wooden table. He never reached it. A red laser dot settled squarely on the center of the snake tattoo coiling around his neck, and the metallic click of a dozen tactical rifles sounded like a choir of death from the shadows of the doorway. Alessandro didn't fire. He walked forward until the barrel of his own weapon was inches from Silas's forehead, his expression so devoid of mercy that the air in the room seemed to vanish. In the corner, slumped in a wooden chair with her hands bound in thick plastic zip ties, was Elena Rivera. She was pale and trembling, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes ignited with a desperate, disbelieving hope as she saw the man in the black suit. Alessandro gave her a single, sharp nod, a silent promise kept, before turning his full, lethal attention back to the man with the snake. "Alessandro, wait," Silas stammered, his hands flying up, palms out, as he backed against the peeling wallpaper. "We were going to call you. We were just holding her for the Rivera debt. 20 grand, Alessandro. It's business. You know how it is. We can split it, 50-50. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alessandro lowered his gun slightly, but his posture remained wound like a spring. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his fingers moving slowly. Silas's eyes followed the movement, expecting a ledger or a stack of hush money. Instead, Alessandro pulled out the jagged, dry piece of bread Sammy had given him. "You think this is about $20,000? Alessandro asked, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that made the window panes rattle. He held the bread up to Silas's face, forcing him to look at the dusty crust. "A 4-year-old boy stood on a street corner and offered me his only meal to save his mother. He gave me everything he had while your people were in here laughing about a payday." "It's just a kid, Alessandro. He doesn't know—" The back of Alessandro's hand connected with Silas's jaw in a blur of motion, sending the man crashing into the table. Alessandro didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed Silas by the collar, hauling him up until they were nose to nose. "That kid has more honor in a nickel of his nail than you have in your entire bloodline. You didn't just take a woman, Silas. You brought the smell of the gutter into my territory. You made a child go hungry under my watch." Alessandro shoved Silas back, looking around the room at the other 3 vultures who were now pinned against the walls by his tactical team. He didn't see rivals. He didn't even see enemies. He saw filth that needed to be scrubbed from the concrete. "I'm not here to talk about the $20,000, Alessandro said, his voice regaining a sharp administrative coldness. "Consider the debt paid. It was settled in full with a piece of bread. But there's a new bill on the table, and the price is your presence in this city." He stepped toward the center of the room, his gold chain glinting under the flickering fluorescent light. "You are being evicted, not from this building and not from this district. You are being evicted from El Mirador, from this city, from every street where my name is spoken. You have until the sun touches the horizon to be gone. If any of you are found 50 miles of these docks by dawn, you won't be going to a cell. You'll be going to the bottom of that river." "You can't do that," one of the younger thugs yelled with cracks of bravado. "We have connections. We have—" The sound of a dozen safeties being flipped to auto silenced him instantly. Alessandro didn't even look at the boy. He walked over to Elena, pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, and sliced through her zip ties with a single practice motion. He caught her as she stumbled forward, her legs weak from days of confinement. "Sammy is waiting," Alessandro whispered to her, his tone shifting so abruptly it was jarring. He handed her his suit jacket to cover her torn clothes, the fabric still warm from his body. He turned back to the vultures one last time. He didn't point his gun, he simply held up the piece of bread. "This was the most expensive contract I've ever signed. Don't make me come back to collect the change." As Alessandro led Elena toward the door, his team moved in, clearing the room with the efficiency of a hurricane. The vultures were left in the ruins of their nest, broken and terrified, realizing too late that they had tried to play a game with a man who valued a child's bread more than their lives. Outside, the shipyard air felt cleaner. Alessandro helped Elena into the back of the SUV, then stood for a moment by the open door. He felt the piece of bread in his pocket, now slightly more crumbled from the fight. The mission was half over. The mother was safe. Now he had to make sure in Alessandro Cruz's city, no child had to use their lunch to buy a miracle again. The heavy steel door didn't just open, it disintegrated under the force of a hydraulic ram, the scream of twisting metal lost beneath the blinding white pulse of a flashbang. Alessandro stepped through the haze of smoke and plaster dust before the echoes had even faded. He moved with a terrifying, calm deliberation, his .45 held low and steady, a shadow emerging from the fire. Inside, the room was a portrait of squalor, half-empty bottles, overflowing ashtrays, and the panicked, blinded scrambling of men who had thought they were untouchable. Silas was the first to regain his sight, his hand clawing desperately for a pistol on the scarred wooden table. He never reached it. A red laser dot settled squarely on the center of the snake tattoo coiling around his neck, and the metallic click of a dozen tactical rifles sounded like a choir of death from the shadows of the doorway. Alessandro didn't fire. He walked forward until the barrel of his own weapon was inches from Silas's forehead, his expression so devoid of mercy that the air in the room seemed to vanish. In the corner, slumped in a wooden chair with her hands bound in thick plastic zip ties, was Elena Rivera. She was pale and trembling, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes ignited with a desperate, disbelieving hope as she saw the man in the black suit. Alessandro gave her a single, sharp nod, a silent promise kept, before turning his full, lethal attention back to the man with the snake. "Alessandro, wait," Silas stammered, his hands flying up, palms out, as he backed against the peeling wallpaper. "We were going to call you. We were just holding her for the Rivera debt. 20 grand, Alessandro. It's business. You know how it is. We can split it, 50-50. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alessandro lowered his gun slightly, but his posture remained wound like a spring. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his fingers moving slowly. Silas's eyes followed the movement, expecting a ledger or a stack of hush money. Instead, Alessandro pulled out the jagged, dry piece of bread Sammy had given him. "You think this is about $20,000? Alessandro asked, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that made the window panes rattle. He held the bread up to Silas's face, forcing him to look at the dusty crust. "A 4-year-old boy stood on a street corner and offered me his only meal to save his mother. He gave me everything he had while your people were in here laughing about a payday." "It's just a kid, Alessandro. He doesn't know—" The back of Alessandro's hand connected with Silas's jaw in a blur of motion, sending the man crashing into the table. Alessandro didn't give him time to recover. He grabbed Silas by the collar, hauling him up until they were nose to nose. "That kid has more honor in a nickel of his nail than you have in your entire bloodline. You didn't just take a woman, Silas. You brought the smell of the gutter into my territory. You made a child go hungry under my watch." Alessandro shoved Silas back, looking around the room at the other 3 vultures who were now pinned against the walls by his tactical team. He didn't see rivals. He didn't even see enemies. He saw filth that needed to be scrubbed from the concrete. "I'm not here to talk about the $20,000, Alessandro said, his voice regaining a sharp administrative coldness. "Consider the debt paid. It was settled in full with a piece of bread. But there's a new bill on the table, and the price is your presence in this city." He stepped toward the center of the room, his gold chain glinting under the flickering fluorescent light. You are being evicted, not from this building and not from this district. You are being evicted from El Mirador, from this city, from every street where my name is spoken. You have until the sun touches the horizon to be gone. If any of you are found 50 miles of these docks by dawn, you won't be going to a cell. You'll be going to the bottom of that river. "You can't do that," one of the younger thugs yelled with cracks of bravado. "We have connections. We have—" The sound of a dozen safeties being flipped to auto silenced him instantly. Alessandro didn't even look at the boy. He walked over to Elena, pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, and sliced through her zip ties with a single practice motion. He caught her as she stumbled forward, her legs weak from days of confinement. "Sammy is waiting," Alessandro whispered to her, his tone shifting so abruptly it was jarring. He handed her his suit jacket to cover her torn clothes, the fabric still warm from his body. He turned back to the vultures one last time. He didn't point his gun, he simply held up the piece of bread. "This was the most expensive contract I've ever signed. Don't make me come back to collect the change." As Alessandro led Elena toward the door, his team moved in, clearing the room with the efficiency of a hurricane. The vultures were left in the ruins of their nest, broken and terrified, realizing too late that they had tried to play a game with a man who valued a child's bread more than their lives. Outside, the shipyard air felt cleaner. Alessandro helped Elena into the back of the SUV, then stood for a moment by the open door. He felt the piece of bread in his pocket, now slightly more crumbled from the fight. The mission was half over. The mother was safe. Now he had to make sure in Alessandro Cruz's city, no child had to use their lunch to buy a miracle again. The sun had not yet crusted the horizon when the lights of Bella Vista, Alessandro's private estate lounge, flickered to life. By 6 in the morning, the room was filled with the most influential and the most intimidated business owners in El Mirador. There were grocery magnates, the owners of the local shipping docks, and even the small-scale landlords who held the leases on the crumbling tenements. They sat around a long, polished mahogany table, whispering in hushed, nervous tones. They had seen the black SUVs screaming through the shipyard at midnight. They knew the vultures had vanished, but they didn't yet know what that meant for the rest of them. When Alessandro entered, the room went cold. He was no longer the disheveled warrior from the docks. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, his short beard trimmed with lethal precision, and his gold chain resting heavy against a black silk tie. He walked to the head of the table, but he didn't sit. He stood with his hands gripped on the back of the chair, his muscular frame casting a long shadow over the men who controlled the city's flow of money. Without a word of greeting, Alessandro reached into his pocket. The room held its breath, expecting him to pull out a ledger of debts or a weapon. Instead, he placed a small white linen handkerchief on the mahogany surface. He unfolded it with slow, deliberate care to reveal the jagged, dry piece of bread Sammy had given him. It looked small and insignificant against the backdrop of the expensive room, but to Alessandro, it was the only thing on the table with any real value. "This," Alessandro began, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the windows, "is the currency of El Mirador from this day forward." The business owners exchanged confused glances. One of the grocery wholesalers, a man named Henderson, who had grown fat on inflated prices in the poor districts, cleared his throat. "Alessandro, we're all glad the Silas situation is handled, but what does a piece of bread have to do with—" "Everything," Alessandro interrupted, his sharp eyes locking onto Henderson's. "This bread was a contract. It was paid to me by a boy who hadn't eaten in 2 days because he was saving his lunch to buy a miracle. He was starving in a neighborhood where you own the markets. He was living in a building where he pointed a tattooed finger at a nervous landlord, collect the rent every first of the month. He leaned forward, his palms flat on the table, his face inches from the men who managed the neighborhood's resources. I rule this city through fear, and you manage it through greed. We both forgot that we have a responsibility to the soil we stand on. We allowed a child to reach the point where his only hope was a mafia boss because the legitimate world had already left him for dead. The silence was absolute. Alessandro picked up the bread, holding it between his thumb and forefinger like a rare diamond. The vultures are gone, but the rot they fed on started here. From now on, the rules have changed. I don't care about your margins or your quarterly projections. If a child in this city goes hungry while your shelves are full, I will consider it a personal insult. If a mother is threatened because she can't pay a debt she didn't earn, you will deal with me, not a debt collector. He straightened up, his posture projecting an undeniable sovereign authority. This bread is the currency of El Mirador from this day forward. Henderson started to speak, but the look in Alessandro's eyes, a cold, predatory fire, cut him off before a single syllable could escape. Alessandro folded the linen cloth back over the bread and tucked it back into his pocket. "The meeting is over," Alessandro said, turning toward the window where the first rays of dawn were finally breaking over the rooftops. "Go back to your shops, open your doors, and remember, I'm not just watching the books anymore, I'm watching the children." As the business owners scrambled out of the room, their faces pale and their hands shaking, Alessandro remained at the window. He watched the city wake up. He knew that fear was a powerful tool, but for the first time in his life, he had used it to build something other than a throne. He had sent a message that would echo through every alleyway and boardroom. In Alessandro Cruz's city, the bread contract was the only law that mattered. The transformation of El Mirador did not happen with a grand announcement or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Instead, it began with the sound of a hammer hitting a nail at 6 a.m. on the very street where Sammy had first tugged on Alessandro's sleeve. The vultures had been scrubbed from the neighborhood like a stain, their white van and their threats replaced by a crew of workers under the direct supervision of Tony and Marco. Alessandro had taken the profits from his most recent port shipment, money that was intended for offshore accounts and luxury investments, and redirected it toward a derelict storefront on the corner. Within weeks, the rusted shutters were replaced by wide, clear glass windows that sparkled under the streetlights. Above the door, a simple wooden sign was hung, bearing no name, only the carved image of a small, hand-drawn loaf of bread. To the casual observer, it looked like a high-end artisanal bakery, but the people of the district knew it was something far more significant. It was the first physical manifestation of the new rule. Alessandro stood across the street on the morning of the opening, his black SUV parked discreetly in the shadows. He wore a simple black turtleneck and slacks, looking less like a warlord and more like a silent guardian. He watched as the smell of fresh yeast and warm flour began to drift through the alleyways, a scent that had been absent from this part of the city for a generation. It was the scent of security. The door to the bakery opened, and for the first time in the history of El Mirador, the price of a loaf of bread was not measured in coins, but in community. Alessandro had made it clear to Mrs. Gable, whom he had hired to run the operation with an unlimited budget. No child was to be turned away, and no family was to leave with an empty hand. The dirty money that had once bought silence and fear was now buying flour, milk, and the dignity of a warm meal. As the morning progressed, a familiar figure appeared on the sidewalk. Sammy, looking healthier and wearing a brand new gray hoodie that fit him properly, walked toward the shop. He wasn't alone. Elena was with him, her face no longer a mask of terror, but a portrait of quiet resilience. They didn't have to look for Alessandro. They knew he was there, a shadow in the periphery of their lives, watching over the peace he had bled to establish. Sammy didn't go inside immediately. He stopped at the window and looked at his reflection, then at the golden brown crusts lining the shelves. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny copper coin he had found on the sidewalk. He looked toward the black SUV, and for a fleeting moment, his eyes met Alessandro's through the tinted glass. Alessandro watched as Sammy entered the shop, handed the coin to Mrs. Gable as a deposit, and walked out minutes later carrying a massive, steaming loaf of bread. The boy tore off the end, the very best piece, and handed it to his mother. They sat on the stoop of their apartment building, eating together in the morning sun. The king of the concrete felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth in his chest. He had spent 15 years building a kingdom of shadows, thinking that power was the ability to take whatever he wanted. But as he watched Sammy laugh with his mouth full of bread, Alessandro realized that true power was the ability to give back what the world had tried to steal. The community kitchen and the bakery were just the beginning. He had already signed the deeds for a new after-school center and a medical clinic. He tapped the glass of the window, and Tony put the SUV into gear. "It's a good start," Alessandro whispered to himself, the jagged piece of Sammy's original bread still tucked safely in his pocket. The vultures were gone, but the new rule was just taking root. In this city, the currency had changed, and the king was finally at peace with the exchange. 10 years had passed over El Mirador, but the concrete seemed to have softened under the steady hand of the man who ruled it. The shipyard district was no longer a place of ghosts and vultures. It had become a neighborhood where children played until the streetlights hummed to life, shielded by an invisible, ironclad promise. Alessandro Cruz sat in his top-floor office at Bella Vista, the city lights below him twinkling like a sea of diamonds. He was older now, the dark hair at his temples dusted with silver, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by a decade of maintaining a peace that was harder to keep than any war he had ever fought. He remained as sharp as the crease in his charcoal suit. His muscular frame had traded some of its explosive speed for a weathered, immovable strength, and the tattoos on his neck had faded slightly, blurring into the story of a man who had seen too much but refused to look away. He didn't move with the same predatory restlessness anymore. He moved with the quiet, terrifying gravity of a man who no longer needed to prove his power. On the corner of his vast mahogany desk, positioned even more prominently than his phones or his ledgers, sat a small, airtight glass case. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the jagged, fossilized remains of a half loaf of bread. It was dry, dusty, and crumbling at the edges, a relic of a Tuesday evening that had rewritten the laws of the city. To a stranger, it was trash. To Alessandro, it was the most expensive contract he had ever signed, a constant reminder that his soul had been bought for the price of a child's lunch. His office door opened without a knock, a privilege reserved for only a few. A young man stepped inside, tall and lean, with messy brown hair and a bright, confident energy that seemed to light up the room. Sammy was no longer the toddler in the stained gray t-shirt. At 14, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that Alessandro had nurtured like a rare flame. He was wearing a clean apron over his clothes, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were beginning to show the strength of a baker's work. "The morning batch is done, Alessandro," Sammy said, his voice dropping into a respectful baritone. "Mrs. Gable says the sourdough is the best we've had all year. I brought you a loaf, still warm." Alessandro looked up, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his beard. He watched as Sammy placed a fresh, steaming loaf on the side table. This was the ritual. Every day, the boy who had once offered a half loaf to save his mother now provided the bread that fed the man who had saved them both. Sammy worked at the community bakery every afternoon after school, not because he had to, but because he understood the weight of the new rule better than anyone. "How is your mother, Sammy?" Alessandro asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "She's good. She's teaching the literacy class at the center tonight. She still says the lavender soap you send her smells like the day she came home." Alessandro nodded, his gaze following Sammy's to the last crust. "People ask me why I keep it," the Mafia Boss whispered, his voice like the low rumble of a distant storm. "They think I'm sentimental. They don't realize that as long as that bread is on my desk, I can't forget what it feels like to be hungry. And as long as I remember that, this city stays safe." Sammy walked over to the desk, his hand hovering near the glass. "You kept your word, Alessandro. Nobody in El Mirador has had to use their lunch to hire a hero since that night." "Because you were the hero first, kid. You were the one who taught a monster how to be a man." They stood together for a moment, looking out over the city Sammy would one day help lead. Below them, the bakery was still lit up, a beacon of warmth in the urban sprawl. Alessandro knew that his time as the king of the concrete would eventually end, but the legacy of the bread was immortal. He had traded his dirty money for a clean conscience and his fear for a family. As Sammy turned to head back to the bakery, he stopped at the door. "See you tomorrow, boss?" Alessandro looked at the glass case, then back at the young man who was the living proof of his redemption. "Tomorrow, Sammy, and every day after." The door closed and Alessandro was alone with his city. He sat back down, the silence of the office wrapping around him like a shroud. He reached out and touched the glass of the display case, his fingers tracing the shape of the bread. The vultures were a memory, and the bread contract was the law. In the heart of the most dangerous man in the city, the last crust remained, a small, dusty piece of hope that had proven once and for all that even the hardest hearts could be broken by a single act of kindness.